Okay, so hopefully you have all now completed the quiz, and hopefully you went well. If there's anything, of course, you're not sure about from the quiz, feel free to post it up on the discussion board, and let's have a chat about those things. But the answers were there, and hopefully that all makes sense to you. So, as I said in the first part of the lecture, was that what we're going to be doing this week is having a look at stress management. So we've looked at stress from a physiological perspective and what happens in the body when the autonomic nervous system is sympathetically stimulated or parasympathetically stimulated, what the fight-flight responses are, all of these sorts of things. We've also looked at the biomarkers for stress, so ways that we can measure the effect of stress and allostatic load within the body. And so we looked at things like cortisol, the catecholamines. We also had a closer look at heart rate variability and how to analyze a heart rate variability tracing so that we can determine whether a person is working sympathetically or parasympathetically. So all of these are biomarkers of stress that tell us that the allostatic load that is building on that person is high, low, or in a eustress state, so it's nice and homeostatically balanced. And we now need to understand what that means from a stress perspective. So what we're going to do now is start by just defining what is stress from a stress management perspective. So stress, the word stress, really refers to the physical and emotional states experienced as a result of changes and challenges in our lives. So typically when we use this word stress, we use it with a very negative connotation. We go, well, the person's stressed, and therefore, their health is being challenged, their wellness is being challenged, and it's all downhill from there. When in actual fact, we must keep in mind that the stress response is an adaptive response. It's a normal functioning process that the human body and mind goes through in order to respond to a stressor. Now, if we didn't respond, then we would be in trouble. So low stress response is just as bad as having a high or prolonged stress response. But an appropriate stress response, emotional or physical state that results from changes and challenges is perfectly normal, and we shouldn't try to interfere with that. What we're responding to, of course, is stressors. And so stressors are situations that trigger the physical and emotional reaction in our body. If we stepped out on the curb in front of a car and suddenly we realized that the car was there, and we reacted quickly and we jumped back out of the way, back onto the pavement with our heart racing and our breath racing, and we're a bit shaky, yeah, that's not a nice feeling to be in. And yes, that's not a great thing to have happened, but that fight-flight response kicking in, that stress response that kicked in, is what saved your life. It's what got you out of the way. You can imagine if you had a low stress response, you wouldn't have responded in time, and you've been at risk of being injured. So stepping out in front of a car is a modern day analogy to our evolutionary past, where we would have been perhaps chased by the saber-toothed tiger, and we would have had to have run away or fought that tiger in order to survive. We would need that stress response to kick in to give us the ability to do that. So the car or the saber-toothed tiger, the situation we find ourselves in, is the stressor. Our response to that is the stress. Now, if you can imagine, after we got out the way of the car's driven by, we're perfectly safe. What should start to happen immediately is that the stress response will turn itself off and begin to tone down, and soon after we should return to a state of homeostatic equilibrium physiologically. We should be mentally okay. We should be cognitively going, all right, I need to not be gazing at my phone while I'm walking down the street. That was a bit silly. I was distracted, wasn't paying attention. Lesson learned. Let's move on. But if we found ourselves hours or even days later still with a level of anxiety, still feeling stressed, still getting shaky, still having physiological reactions because of that event, that would be an abnormal and prolonged stress event. And that would then start to really affect our wellness and affect our well-being. And so we would have to have a look at why that was happening. And that's the kind of basis, I suppose, where conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder come from, where once a person is removed from that stressful environment or that stressful event, and that stressful event or that stressor is no longer directly affecting them, their stress response hasn't turned off to that event, and so it continues, and then they have the PTSD develops. And this can happen in various ways, where people have been traumatized, and then something down the track may happen. They think they've got over that trauma, but something down the track happens, and all of a sudden it triggers a re-traumatization event. The stress comes back on. All of these things are abnormal stress responses, and we need to bring in effective methods for dealing with those. Now, obviously, if we're dealing with traumatization or we're dealing with PTSD, then the best course of action is referral to a counsellor or psychologist or professional who is trained in dealing with those particular conditions. But if we're just dealing with somebody who is suffering the effects of prolonged everyday stress of having to work and rush around and be busy and never have time out for themselves, and they're not looking after their diet and they're not looking after their sleep, and they're engaging perhaps in health behaviours which aren't promoting health, smoking and alcohol use, and late nights and sitting in front of screens working till all hours of the morning, and they are in that state of stress because of the way their lifestyle is being lived, then of course they don't necessarily need counselling or psychology to deal with that. What they need is counselling and mentoring on how to redevelop more healthy lifestyle approaches to their wellness. In defining stress, we have a couple of other terms that we need to be quite familiar with. The first one is distress, and this is a negative form of stress that occurs in reaction to something we perceive as bad. So this distress can be something that happens acutely. We perceive it as bad, so we see something that we didn't expect. Perhaps we witnessed a car accident, perhaps we got some bad news about a friend or a family member, and we get upset about that. So we become distressed about that. So it's a normal emotional reaction to these things to perhaps be a bit shocked, or to be upset, or to be saddened, or to experience grief. Those are normal responses. Even though they're still stress responses, they're quite normal responses. But if the stress response that we have is out of proportion or prolonged, or is having a more significant mental, emotional or physiological effect on us, then would be, expected from the situation that we were in, for example, we would refer to that as being distress, which is a negative form of stress because of something that we've perceived as being bad. The opposite of that, of course, is eustress. So, in fact, being really happy about something and being really excited about something is also a stress state. but it's a good stress state. So we get really excited because we're going to see our favorite band, or you know, our friend or our partner who's been away for some time is finally coming home, and we get very excited about that, and we become sometimes a bit emotional about those sorts of situations. That's a stress response within the body again, but it's eustress, it's good stress. So it's not negative, it's not neutral stress. It's not an absence of stress. It's just a form of stress that occurs in reaction to something that we perceive as good. And so we want a little bit more of that, but we don't want too much eustress. And we really want to have as little as possible of the distress. But we want to have a normalized stress reaction to other stresses that occur throughout our lives. So in the 1970s, Hans Selye did some research, and he defined this model known as general adaptation syndrome. And you visited this previously back in session 2 or 3, so it should be relatively familiar to you. Now, in the gas model, we have 3 stages of stress. The first stage is alarm. This is the fight or flight response. This is the acute response. Now, this alarm stage is perfectly normal. It's what we want to happen. If we step out in front of that car, or we're being chased by that saber-toothed tiger, we want the fight-flight response to kick in. We want the alarm stage to become activated so that we've got the best chance at survival. Once that acute phase of whatever's happened has passed, then if the stressor persists, then we need to go into a resistance stage. And the resistance stage basically means we go into a state of physiological and psychological and emotional adaptation that allows us to continue to deal with the stressor for a prolonged period of time and maintain a normalized physiological function systemically throughout the body. So if we find ourselves with a big project at work, and we're starting to work long hours, and for the next couple of weeks we've just got to cope with a very particularly busy time, and there's a bit of stress going on around that situation. Perhaps we're a university student and we've got our final exams coming up, and we've got to get through study and we've got to get through our exams. Then that goes beyond the acute stage of stress. It's not an event that just happens instantly. We respond, we react to it, the event's over, then we recover. This is a state where the stress response, the stress response needs to be prolonged for a moderate period of time. And in order for that to happen, we need to go into an adaptive state that enables us to resist the negative effects of that chronic stress. However, if that adaptive state has to go on for too long, then what happens is we deplete the ability of the body to continue to adapt and respond to the stressor, and we start to go into the exhaustion stage, where the resources we need to adapt and respond to the stressor are becoming exhausted. We just don't have the energy, we just don't have the hormonal balance, we just don't have the mental balance, we just don't have the emotional balance to continue to deal with this stress. And that means we're going into an exhaustion stage. That means our adaptive processes are now starting to become increasingly maladaptive, and this is where our well-being and our wellness is really going to start to be affected. And even more chronically, this is where we're going to start to see health issues and diseases arising because of that chronic, prolonged maladaptive state that is going on. Now, when we look at this in terms of the graph here, and you can find this on page 57 of your textbook, stage 1, the alarm stage, has two kind of divisions to it. Firstly is there's a shock stage. So when you first get that real fright, that real scare, and at that very short period of time, initially, our resistance to that stress is lowered. And physiologically, that allows the stress response to kick in because we're not going to resist the stress, but it's kind of just snuck up on us and we weren't quite ready for it. But then very quickly what should happen is the stress response will kick in. So we have this counter shock phase of that. And this is when the body is mobilizing its resources and we are increasing our resistance to that stress. Now, if it was an acute shock or an acute stress situation, stepping out in front of the car, etc., and we got out the way and everything's fine and we're happy, then it should all just go back to normal levels of resistance to stress. We should just return to homeostatic balance. But if it's the work-related or the exam-related stress that's kicked in at this stage, then we're going to progress into stage 2, which is the resistance stage. Now, in the resistance stage, our resistance to the stress or to the stressors will continue to increase for a period of time to its maximum optimal function, and then it will start to decline after that. We've only got a limited resource available to us at that point in time to continue to be resistant. So resistance levels off and then eventually it begins to decline. If we don't resolve the stress before that resistance stage declines too far, then what's going to happen is we're going to enter stage 3, which is the exhaustion stage. And early in stage 3, we may still have some level of resistance, and we may still have the resources to continue our adaptive processes for a short period of time. But if we don't do something fairly quickly, fairly spontaneously, then those resources are going to be exhausted and our resistance levels are going to fall below the normalized homeostatic resistance level. And that's when we're really going into the maladaptive processes, and this is where we're going to start to really suffer the effects of stress now. So this is when resistance is depleted and it's leading to exhaustion. And once we get to that stage, that's really the stage where we just have to stop. We need to remove ourselves out of the situation because the body, the mind, the emotions just do not have the energy for us to be able to respond. So that's the first part. Very interesting stuff, being able to clearly define stress, stressors, distress, eustress, and how all of that fits into the GAS model. So we understand the 3 stages of the stress response, and ideally what we need to be doing is responding to the stress, putting in place strategies for managing stress before we get to that exhaustion stage.